I've been getting a lot of questions recently asking how I get my game to look like this, and this. So today I'm leaking all of my secrets and going through the exact shader settings I use in my hardcore Minecraft world. So let's get right into it. Alright, so the first thing you're going to need to do is actually install the shaders. I'm not going to go through how to do that in this video. So if you're unsure, I've linked a video down below. So if you need to, check that out before we start. So I use the complementary unbound shaders, and that's the shader I'm going to be showing you the settings for today. Alright, so I'll start on this main page here as soon as you load up the settings. And the first thing I have toggled obviously is the visual style set to unbound. This just distinguishes the difference between the complementary reimagined shader pack and the complementary unbound style. The main difference between the two styles is mainly the clouds and the water. As you can see, the clouds have a bit more of a blocky texture in reimagined. Same with the water. It maintains the vanilla textures of the water more than unbound does. Whereas unbound makes the clouds a little bit more realistic and deviate from the typical vanilla water textures as well. Right, so the first thing I'm going to click on here is performance settings. And I've changed only a couple of things here compared to how you'll receive the shader pack when you first download it. The differences here are real-time shadows set to low, light shaft quality also set to low, and cloud quality set to low. This is primarily to bump up my performance a little bit. I don't notice that much difference between these settings on medium and low, medium being the setting that the shader pack sets you up with. So if I don't notice a clear visual difference, and I can get even a little bit of FPS boost, I'm willing to set those to low. Okay, that's all I've changed for the performance settings. Next, I'll move into lighting. Lighting color multipliers is where you would amplify certain colors in the terrain and world around you. So for example, if I wanted this bamboo to be a bit more green, if I turn the green multiplier up, the green would pop slightly more than it would if I had it on the default multiplier. I didn't change any of these settings because I think it looks just fine how it is. But what I did change was the cave lighting multiplier, which I set all the way up to 1600. This is mainly for content purposes so that I can film and have you guys see everything clearly without having to squint at the screen. Some would say it takes away from the cave aspect of the game, being that it's meant to be dark, but I just find it easier to record, not having to worry about the brightness of my screen. Okay, moving on to materials and integrated PBR Plus materials. Everything in this page is set to the default values, but I just want to mention, I get a lot of comments about the glowing ores in my videos, in which this setting here is responsible for that. Now, this should be on by default, but if it's not, this is where you can find it, and setting this on or off or set by style can toggle that. All right, let's move on to the water tab here. Everything here is set to the default settings, except for the underwater colors. By default, everything should be set to 100. However, I've changed mine to have the underwater red multiplier set to 90, the underwater blue multiplier set to 110, and the green multiplier also set to 110. This to me just makes the water feel a bit more refreshing and blue. Aside from that, in the water tab, waving textures are exactly the same as default, and the only other thing I've changed here is rain puddles, which I have set to puddles in rain. This is different to the off setting, which is the default one, and basically puddles in rain just makes it so when it's raining, you see little patches of water that add a bit of reflection and realism to the game. Okay, let's move on to the camera settings now. Everything here is default except for motion blur, which I have on. Now, this is a controversial one, and I've had a few comments criticizing me for having motion blur on. However, I just like playing with it on. It makes the game feel more cinematic and more enjoyable in my opinion, but this is personal preference. You can toggle this on or off. It doesn't really make that much difference. All right, I'm going to move on to color balance now, and I've changed a couple of things here. The first being general brightness changed from 1 to 2. This again is mainly for recording purposes so that you guys can see a bit better in darker situations, and that just makes it so I don't have to go in post-recording and play around with the brightness in my editing software. That said, I'd probably play with it on regardless of whether I was recording or not. It just makes it way easier to see things in game. And then the only other thing I've changed here is the saturation of paler colors, which I've set from 1 to 1.15. Now this does exactly what it says it does, and it just makes paler colors a little bit more saturated, and in my opinion just makes the game feel a little bit more alive. And I changed nothing in world blur, so we can head back into the main page now. Alright, now let's move on over to the atmosphere tab, and this is what everyone's been asking for. To get this incredible night sky that I always have in my videos, you want to switch the aurora condition to every night. The style remains the default. All this does is make sure that it occurs every single night in game rather than only appearing in certain conditions. So make sure you toggle this on if you want your game to look like this. Everything in this main page here is the same. Okay, aside from that, in the atmosphere tab, the only things that I've changed and the only things we need to worry about are in the fog tab and the nether dimension tab. So let's start with the fog tab. Literally the only thing that I've changed here is atmospheric fog, all the way from intense to very subtle. Not really anything game changing, I just don't really care for atmospheric fog that much, so I set it all the way down to the bottom. But that's it for fog, so let's head back into the nether dimension. This is where I've changed the nether view limit from 16 to 20. I set the nether storm lower altitude to 40, the nether storm opacity to 0.35, and the storm height to 220. Okay, and we have the other tab here, and the first and most important thing to note in this tab is the selection outline settings. Some of you have asked me how I get the block overlay in my game, in which you're referring to this. And the answer to that question is I set my selection outline to versatile. To make it a little bit easier to see, I set the brightness from 1 to 1.25. And that's going to give you that selection outline that highlights the block that you're looking at. The other setting I've changed here is in world outline, in which I have world outline toggled on. I set the brightness down actually from 150 to 120. The thickness is the same, everything else is the same. But essentially you toggle this on if you want your game to be a bit more animated and sharp. So you can see here in the default version of the game, the edges and corners, well, the outline of the blocks are quite harsh and sharp. But when you switch world outline on, it gives it a bit of a softer edge, and obviously the more you increase the thickness or the brightness, the more prominent that edge will be. And yeah, aside from that, these are all the same, and that's about it. That's the last setting. If you want to see how these shaders look in a real gameplay situation, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode of my Hardcore Minecraft series. And while you wait, you can check out the previous episodes that are on the screen now.